wonderful to see you. My name is Ross Overline, and I'm the CEO and co-founder of Scholars of Finance. For those of us who haven't met, I want to thank you all for joining us today for our National Speaker Series. We're very fortunate to be joined by Teri List, who is a board director at Microsoft, to have her share her insights on courage and what she's done throughout her career to act courageously, especially during times of uncertainty like we've all experienced the last several months. This is especially exciting for us as courage was our value of the month for November. So this will be a great way to close out last month and prepare for the end of 2020. For the first 25 to 30 minutes, Teri and I will share a discussion centered around her work and values. And for the second half of the call, we'll open up to Q&A from our students on the line here. If you're able, we encourage you to turn your camera on so you can speak with Teri directly. Please also mute your mic and be prepared to unmute to ask questions during the Q&A portion. If you have a question come up while Teri is speaking, just write it down, keep it on you, and I'll let everyone know when we're about to start the Q&A, and you can use the raise hand feature in Zoom to add yourself to the queue and have a conversation with Teri. And with that, I want to share a bit more about Teri to get us started. And then we'll turn it over to Teri, who I know we're all excited to hear from. Teri List has had an exceptional career in corporate finance. As I mentioned, she currently serves as a board director for Microsoft, and formerly served as the Executive Vice President and Chief Financial Officer at Gap, where she oversaw its finance, real estate, and information technology organizations. She also serves on the board of directors of Danaher Corporation and DoubleVerify. Teri also formerly served as the Executive Vice President and Chief Financial Officer of Dick's Sporting Goods and Kraft Foods Group. From 1944 to 2013, prior to that, she was with Procter & Gamble, progressing to Senior Vice President and Treasurer. Before this, spending over 9 years at Deloitte & Touche, where she provided financial counsel to large multinational companies. In addition, she has a bachelor's degree in accounting from Northern Michigan University and is a certified public accountant. One thing that you will not see on Teri's bio yet, soon we will also be publicly announcing that Teri has joined the advisory board of Scholars of Finance, and she has already proven to be an invaluable coach to our organization in just a few short months. Teri, thank you so much for joining us. It's a pleasure to have you with us today.
Happy to be here. Very happy to be here. I just have to say, listening to that introduction made me realize just how many years I have been working. Although, for clarity, you said I've been at Procter & Gamble since 1944, and I just want to correct that. Not true. Didn't start there in 1944.
1994, everyone, in case I missed that.
I mean, I'm old, but I am not that old. I just want to be clear.
Thank you for the correction. Teri, to start us off, can you share a bit about your story and time working in corporate finance?
Sure. It's been an amazing journey. As you can see, I've worked for over 35 years, and you learn a lot, of course, over a career like that, particularly when you're in finance. And the role of finance person is unique in a corporate environment, because on the plus side, you tend to be involved in literally everything going on in the company. But on the more challenging side, finance is often looked to as the steward of the company or the conscience of the company. And so you often find yourself, having to hold the line for some pretty challenging decisions or considerations or conversations that have to go on. And so I think that the notion of having courage as a core value and having that be a special topic for us to be thinking about is relevant uniquely for finance professionals. And it's certainly something that I look back on my career and realize just how important it is. I have always had a favorite definition of leadership that I've used, and I have it, if I were savvy enough to smoothly shift between Zoom and my screen, I could share it all with you, but I'll just read it to you, because it's always been, this goes over decades, this has been my favorite leadership definition. And it is that a leader is one who is courageous, first word, inspiring, and collaborative, who helps everyone around them take risks, fail occasionally, learn continuously, and ultimately deliver sustainable breakthrough results. And so for decades, that notion of courage and collaboration and taking risks have been sort of foundational in my career journey. And I've I've spent big chunks of time at companies like Procter and Gamble or Deloitte, and then I've had shorter stints at places like Kraft Foods, Dick's Sporting Goods, and Gap. And it's been a journey that has taught me a lot. And one of the key things that I've learned is that you really do have to be willing to embrace a bit of serendipity in your career. You need to be willing to, as I said, take some risks, have the courage, but then recognize that you can't have a full plan for everything. And sometimes the most serendipitous moves actually are the ones that give you the best skills and experiences from which to draw as you build the portfolio that then creates your career. So I'm happy to answer any questions you all have as we get to the second part of this, but it's been quite a journey for sure.
Thanks, Teri. I really appreciate you sharing that definition of leadership. I found myself almost taking mental notes of, checking, am I doing that? Am I doing that? Am I doing that? Sort of running through each of those criteria. And I think having that definition of a courageous leader is really helpful. And I'm sure I'm sure I'm not the only one here that's been writing down notes voraciously already. One thing I wanted to ask you is you kind of jump right into courage, which I really appreciate. What has courage looked like very tangibly throughout your career in finance, right? Can you maybe share some of those moments or those stories where you had to exercise courage, right? Where you actually had to put it to work. What were some of those situations that students here might expect or might anticipate and start preparing themselves for?
As I said, in finance, particularly in the corporate world, the finance person, whether they're an analyst or a CFO, has a unique role as the steward of company assets, and therefore, and they're also the ones that oftentimes will embrace the passion and enthusiasm that often is surrounding a project, but then has to be the one to inject the sober facts that sometimes temper some of that enthusiasm. So I think as I have thought about courage, I think there's two sides of it. That the flip side of courage is confidence, and I think not to make a gender stereotype, but I think for women in particular, having the confidence to speak up is the hardest challenge in living up to the courageous expectations that exist. And this can also be true if you're more junior in the organization than more senior in the organization, in terms of, again, having the confidence to know that your beliefs are appropriate, that you've done the right work, that you're smart enough to be at the table expressing your views. That piece of it is really important. And just to share an early story from my career, and this is more about confidence than courage, but it's foundational. I was early in my career at Deloitte, probably 4 or 5 years in, and doing really well by all measures in a smaller office, but having big clients and doing well relative to my peer group. And I was quite comfortable. And the partner that I worked for at the time called me in and he offered to have me participate in a development program in the firm's national office. And he described it as a terrific opportunity to go to New York and compete with the best and the brightest in the firm. And given where I was in my career, pretty comfortable, doing pretty well, big fish in a small pond kind of scenario, the idea of going to New York and competing with the best and the brightest was terrifying to me. And I expressed some hesitation to the partner, and he kind of stopped and he gave me one of my best career lessons, which was, he said, "Teri, it almost sounds like you're not confident enough to do this. And if you're not confident in yourself, then how can I be confident in you?" And that was like a bit of a pause for me. And I went home and spoke to my husband, and being naturally competitive by all measures, I went in the next day and knocked on the partner's door and said, listen, I'm in, I'm off to New York. I'll take it on. And I went, and it was truly life changing and career changing. And it taught me that important lesson that having confidence is the foundation to having courage and being able to take the risks that are necessary, whether those are risks in how you pursue your career or risks in how you challenge an inappropriate situation, or risks associated with how you support a project or initiative, whether it's in the university setting or in the corporate setting. And so that's, to me, that's been the biggest part of what I've tried to share as I've mentored people over the years, is knowing that you need to be willing to take some risks, you need to be willing to fail, and you need to have confidence in yourself as you're doing that.
Right. That makes so much sense. I love this notion of confidence being the flip side of courage, being a signal of it, right? And it's so interesting to hear that partner viewing your confidence almost as a question mark, right? Actually triggered your courage in that moment and actually inspired confidence and kind of created what sounds like this virtuous sort of self-reinforcing cycle of courage and confidence over time. And I would imagine that did that kind of start compounding throughout your career after that moment? Do you feel like you were more courageous, and by taking that one courageous act, it made it easier to take the next and the next?
Absolutely, absolutely, and that's true of everything. And part of what you asked me was, how do I think of courage? And I was fortunate in every company that I've worked for, really, to be in environments where integrity was foundational. And Procter & Gamble in particular, that it was always a function of doing the right thing the right way. And to me, that's really where courage comes in, is if you're living by inner principle of doing the right thing the right way, then that helps give you the fortitude to really make the challenges necessary, and really pull out the courage when it's required.
Right, right. It brings up a question in my mind, which is, in what ways do you think that our students here on the line will need to be courageous now and also in their early finance careers? When you think back to your college days, that first, second year out of school, what are some of the ways you wished you were courageous, or that, yeah, you would think that the students here will need to be courageous in the immediate or near term?
Yeah, this is a really unique time as we all sit here on Zoom, and it's very obvious. And so, I think one of the important ways that you will need to be courageous is simply being willing to embrace the uncertainty that exists today with respect to what careers will look like, what work life will look like, what jobs will be available, what skills will be important. There's no playbook for what the next few years or even few decades will look like, because what's happening today in this environment is transformative. And we're all learning how to work differently. We're all learning what matters and what doesn't. We're all learning how to reinvent business models to survive in a world where so much has changed. And so I think you all are at such an important juncture as you're watching this unfold and thinking about what's next for you. And you need to really be willing to embrace the uncertainty and use it really as an opportunity to redefine what's important to you. And I think, another place where you have to have courage is the courage to really follow your passions and really understand what matters to you, what's important, what are the priorities you want to have, and then have the courage to follow those, even though the journey might be a little rockier than it might have been a year ago, because of that uncertainty. But it doesn't change the fact that you will perform better, you will be happier if you have matched your career aspirations with your fundamental personal passions. So those are a couple places where I think you will need particular courage. But given early career, the other place that's just a natural need for courage is that willingness to ask questions and learn and know that you don't know everything. And sometimes you don't want to show a vulnerability by having to ask the stupid question. But I guarantee you, you're smart enough that if something doesn't make sense to you, it probably doesn't make sense to other people as well. So you have to have that courage to ask and learn and really make sure that you're building the foundational knowledge today that you'll be able to keep building on through your career. Because if you don't ask the question today, if you wait 6 months, then the question will be a stupid question. So have the courage to speak up, and learn what you need to learn to be able to do your role to the best of your ability. But there's just going to be a lot of places where you're going to have courage to stand by what you believe in and have confidence in yourself.
Thank you actually for sharing this notion of asking stupid questions. I've felt that fear in college, and I've heard a number of students ask, how do you ask great questions? Like, well, first, don't worry about how you look asking the question. Just focus on learning as much as you can. You see lots of light bulbs go off in that moment. And I've actually never heard anyone say that. Like, you might think it's a stupid question. It's not. You're smart enough that other people probably want to know the answer too. But if you wait 6 months, then it might become a stupid question. I've never heard that before, and from anyone, I think that makes so much sense. That questions don't age well necessarily. So thanks for sharing, and
Right.
you recognizing how it can take courage, right, and vulnerability to ask questions and even to demonstrate curiosity. What's interesting, I think back to some of the moments when I've demonstrated courage, that they're kind of throughout the career. For you, during the Great Recession, right, the financial crisis of 07 and 08, you were working at Procter & Gamble in a leadership role in finance. I'm really curious what that was like. And, maybe as a second question, what in your opinion were some of the ethical or, the lapses that happened in finance back then that led to that, and lessons we can take from it?
Yeah, I mean, obviously that was a very difficult time, and I think it can be instructive as we begin to evaluate the current environment and what kind of a recovery the economy may have and what kind of challenges companies will have. And the thing that I remember the most about that time is there's this sort of gut reaction when you're in a tough time to cut everything and maintain profitability, particularly as a large public company where you have investors with expectations, and you don't want to do anything that's going to hurt the stock price. And so there's a tendency to figure out, how can I cut everything to be able to make the earnings targets, or make the company look good. But you're inevitably then sacrificing the long-term health for some short-term results. And that balance of understanding in tough economic times what really is fat that you can cut, spending that you can pull back on without hurting the long-term health of the business, and understanding where do you need to protect investments in innovation, and importantly in talent, in people, because those are the things that over the midterm even will allow you to get back on track faster as the economy strengthens. And so, making those tough calls about where can you cut spending, where can you pull back, what can wait on an investment choice, versus where do you really have to keep going, where do you have to really protect the initiative pipeline or the spending against something that over the long term is absolutely right for shareholder value creation. So I think that's the biggest challenge when you're in tough economic times, is short-term, long-term trade-offs.
Right. I'm really curious for you, when you've been in the boardroom, right, at Microsoft, and one of the largest companies in the world, or even preceding that, when you're in meetings at Gap or other firms, and you're having a conversation with teammates, with peers, with your own team, and you're around people who are just feeling the short-term pressure, who are thinking about those short-term implications. What are some of the ways that you've persuaded others to think in the longer term, right? To think more sustainably, to think more patiently. What have you found effective for navigating those conversations with people who are kind of in that short-term time horizon with their thinking, maybe gripped by fear or anxiety, right? And maybe less prone to listen or be open-minded even.
Yeah, it's a great question, and it's a hard question, right? Because those conversations tend to be quite emotional. And the good thing is, particularly as finance people, we start with facts usually, and usually you can bring to the fore some facts that say, gosh, if we do this, this is likely to happen, and we have history to show that, or we can project out some things. And so oftentimes you can bring numbers to the conversation that allows it to shift. But it is a place where sometimes it just takes, back to the overused word for tonight, courage, to really change the conversation and to make sure that your voice is heard. And you know, as you build on your experiences, the beauty is all of those come together and give you a bit of an arsenal to help influence conversations by bringing those experiences to the table as illustrative in a new situation or case. And so oftentimes you can say, I've seen this happen. If we do this, then this is the likely outcome. And that's not something that we can allow to happen. But oftentimes those conversations are just a matter of leaning on the credibility and influence that you've built up in the relationships with the people around the table, which is why one of the things that I think is so important as we try to build our influence and build our ability to take those courageous stands is to make sure that we're investing in relationships with the people we work with every day. If you're building a foundation of trust in the good times, then you can lean on that in the tough times to really make some of the points that are less favorable, less of the party line, more of a minority view, but one that's really, really important and maybe not very popular. And so those relationships are crucial, that you invest in those with integrity and trust from the very beginning.
I think it's such a salient and important point to share, Terry. Thank you that relationships actually enable courage to some degree. If I'm summarizing that final
Sure.
point properly, it can be easy to, even on the flip side, have no relationship and do something courageous, and then when it's not effective, it doesn't land well. You wonder, well, you know, where did I go wrong? It's just simply there wasn't enough trust, that foundation of a relationship in place for that valid and courageous act to land and to be heard, and for the other person to feel safe hearing it even, right?
Right.
For them to be courageous, you know, to enable their courage on the other side of that conversation, right? Because there's trust and some safety you've developed through the relationship. And actually kind of talking through that notion of relationships and being courageous in relationships and through relationships, I'm really curious to hear what were like some examples or situations, maybe a story or a time where you felt like there was a situation where you had to be very courageous and that relationship really enabled that, right? Where you maybe had a minority view and pressing into that relationship made that go smoothly. If an example comes to mind.
Oh gosh, I have to tell you up front, I'm a terrible storyteller. That's one of my limitations in life. But there have definitely been a number of times, and I think this is a bit telling a tale out of school, so I do it with some trepidation, but it was really an important one for me, because I was in a company where I knew that the fit wasn't good for me. The culture was not consistent with some of the basic principles that I had. But I was early days and I was just still trying to figure it out. And I was speaking with a leader in the company, and I was making what I thought was a harmless suggestion that we should get the women together in the company and do some training and have an event that let the women see that we were really vested in their success, and that we were really supportive of in developing them for future potential. And this person, very senior person, looked at me and said, only if we can have one for the white guys too. And I kind of looked at him and I said, well, we do that every day. My problem for being a bit of a smartass, but I did say we do that every day because it was a primarily male dominated environment. And no offense to the males here. I mean, we love the males, right? We need everybody to be playing in the game. But it told me that it was going to be an environment where diversity and inclusion didn't matter. It was not going to be a priority. There was not going to be a focus on that. In fact, quite the opposite. And so it forced me to really think about what matters and how am I going to respond to a situation like that. And you know, it ended up that I couldn't let it go. I couldn't just say, okay, that's fine. I understand we won't have diversity and inclusion as part of our platform. As a leader of the company, I felt like I really needed to make that happen. And so I pursued it with some other people and, you know, certainly sensed within the organization a real need for work in this area, but I was unsuccessful in getting it sold in. And ultimately I ended up leaving the company, not just for that reason, but because it was just symbolic of what the priorities were, what the culture was. And the company's a great company and they've done very well and they have lots of other benefits, but that was one for me that was a non-starter.
Wow, I mean, thank you so much for sharing that story. And I could only imagine being in that room. And I think that actually segues almost perfectly into the last question I wanted to ask. You know, this topic of diversity, equity, and inclusion is incredibly important to us at Scholars in Finance. It's central to a lot of the work that we do. And even in my own personal life, my mother, I've talked to you about, you know, my mother is a role model of mine. You know, she was shattering the glass ceiling in finance back in the 80s and 90s, right? And I heard so many, what I would call horror stories from her about what it was like being a woman in the industry back then. And even, you know, today I know there's still a lot of systemic inequity and oppression that people face. And I, you know, do my best to try to be part of the solution, you know, try to learn as much as I can, try to help however possible. And I'm curious, you know, as a woman in finance in this industry, what were some of the biggest lessons or realizations you learned? I mean, what advice might you give the women on the call today or who are listening, you know, who couldn't come today, uniquely for them?
Yeah, you know, I think a successful career, so much of it is the same whether you're male or female. But I do think as a woman in finance or an underrepresented minority in finance, there are different challenges because of what we talked about early on, which is that you really need, oftentimes as the finance person, you are the expert, you are the authority, and so you need to be respected. And sometimes it's harder to garner that respect if you can't get a seat at the table, if you can't get your voice to be heard because you don't look like the rest, or you don't act like the rest, or your style is different than the rest. And so there's no question that I had situations where I felt like I was struggling to be heard. Now, I think that there are a lot of ways you can handle those kinds of situations. For me personally, the way that I found it to be most effective is to lean on humor. And I have found that in tense situations, or when you're meeting someone who feels uncomfortable because you're different in whether you're different in gender or different in style or different in ethnic background, whatever it is, sometimes a little bit of humor can just diffuse the situation. It can make people feel a little more comfortable. It can just lighten the mood. And so, you know, I don't want to minimize the challenges that women and minorities face in the workforce, but by saying just tell a joke. But sometimes it can be as simple as make people feel comfortable, take the pressure off, whether it's a tough conversation or an awkward meeting or an uncomfortable first engagement. Just try to make it a little more relaxed, and that is something that I've used effectively and sometimes not effectively, because I think I'm funny and somebody else might think I'm not very funny. But generally speaking, I've found that trying to lighten the mood and make both parties feel comfortable allows you then to have a louder voice at the table, have a more engaged relationship, regardless of who the other party is.
Thanks, Teri. Really appreciate you sharing some of those lessons and insights. I saw that, Jake, you had messaged the group that we're going to move into our Q&A session. I already see questions building up in the queue. So Teri, at this point, I'll turn it over to our students. And anyone, if you have a question, you can also use the raise hand function to add yourself to the queue. It looks like Shubha, you're at the very top of the queue. So if you'd like to introduce yourself, say hello and go first, we'd be happy to hear from you.
Hi, I'm Shubha. I'm currently a senior from the University of Minnesota. I'm part of the Minneapolis chapter. And my question is, how do you continue to ensure that you're growing and learning as a leader and making that commitment to continuous learning?
That's a great question. It's a really important one, because I think that continuous learning is a key element of successful development. And part of it is just kind of testing yourself to make sure, are you feeling sufficiently uncomfortable? If you're feeling too comfortable, then you're probably not pushing yourself hard enough. And in almost every experience that I've had, that I've really found it to be growthful and sort of important in the trajectory of my career, it has been largely doing something where I may be leveraging some of my core capabilities, but I am mostly in a place where I am uncomfortable and generally pretty frightened, for fear that I won't really be able to do it. But the learning is so great in those situations. So I think you need to be pushing yourself to take some chances, to make yourself uncomfortable, to be prepared to try to do something that doesn't take you so far out that you're, literally away from your base, but not so close in that you're not feeling that discomfort of continuous learning.
Awesome. Thanks so much, Teri. And Shubha, thanks for the great question. Alex, I see you're up next. Go for it.
Awesome. Thank you, Ross. My name is Alex Bergino. I'm a senior here at the University of St. Thomas in Minnesota. So my question was kind of just like, with your background and your career history, I guess, what kind of drives your decision making in towards like the next step in your career? I guess, like, what kind of makes you decide which firm you want to work at, or like what kind of position you want to hold at this point?
Yeah. I'm going to give you really bad advice on this one because I have always followed my heart and my guts, and I've never really had a plan that was really well laid out. I've always been somewhat open, as I said in the beginning, to serendipity. I do think that there's probably a happy medium between the way I've done it and the way really disciplined people do it, which is that, have some general ideas about what it is you want to learn next. I always think about, when I'm evaluating opportunities, what does this do to my collective set of skills and experiences? Is it going to give me something new that will allow me then to continue to build and a set of skills and experiences that are valuable in a variety of different opportunities down the road? And so, some people will think about their career in terms of, what's the fastest way for me to get to point A, whether that's vice president or CFO or senior analyst or whatever it is. And I always say, the speed at which you get to a certain place is far less important than what you learn along the way. And sometimes taking a slightly slower, more circuitous route that has higher quality experiences is ultimately going to take you much further over time. And so speed is far less important than the substance of what you're doing. And so I've always tried to think about it in terms of, am I going to learn something? And then I think about it in terms of, is this going to be fun? What we're doing every day is taking a lot of our life. And so I've always wanted to be in businesses where I'm passionate about the business and where I respect and like the people. And so I've probably leaned a little too much toward the fun. I probably could have done some other things and avoided some challenges by being more thoughtful. But I do think it is a little bit of follow your gut against a frame of skills and experiences that matter.
Awesome. Thanks, Alex. Great question. Mia, I see you're next.
Hi, Terry. Thank you for your time today. I'm Mia, a sophomore at NYU. I wanted to ask, what type of advice or skill sets help propel your career? And would you say they were learned in college, more on your own through trial and error, making mistakes, or from past colleagues?
It's a really good question. I think that at the end of the day, I do believe that leadership is a differentiating factor. And leadership is something that is largely learned through experience. So if you think about what needs to be true to be successful in a career, you have to have a certain amount of technical ability. You also have to have, and that's something, a skill you need to keep fresh, right? So that's something you build in college, you start in college, and then you build by both experiences on the job, but then that's that sort of intellectual curiosity that keeps you always trying something new, learning something new, reading something new, et cetera, et cetera. So that foundation of technical capability is something you have to keep very fresh, because everything is changing so fast. You can't just rest on your laurels in terms of having the technical knowledge to be effective. But I think then also a differentiating factor is the ability to communicate. If you know lots and lots of things, but you can't communicate in such a way, whether it's written or oral, but you can't communicate in such a way that you influence, then you only have half of the skill set that's required. So I think technical skills with good communication skills are sort of the core package. And then the ability to bring it all together in a way that can influence people, both peers and leaders, but importantly, subordinates, the people that you're going to over time manage and who you need to invest in and bring along, because those people are the ones who are actually going to make you the most successful. And so I think having leadership capability is ultimately what's going to differentiate the people who are most successful. And I do think that is something you can read about and you can learn intellectually, but you need to demonstrate through personal experience and some success, some failure, but something that comes a little bit from your gut and the cumulative benefit of everything that you have done. I don't know if that makes sense, but it is sort of multifaceted.
Yes, it does make sense. Thank you very much.
Awesome. Yeah, great question, Mia. Really appreciate it. Drake, I see you're up next.
Yeah, thank you, Ross. First of all, Teri, thank you so much for speaking with us. We really appreciate it. Also, 3 really good questions before me, so tough act to follow. But one thing you talked about a little bit earlier was the idea of taking risks and how that takes courage, and that ultimately helped you make the move to New York earlier in your career. But I'm just curious, what were other times that you took risks earlier in your career? Because as a young person, I'm just trying to see how to maximize impact. And like you said, I think it involves taking risks, but I'm just curious what another example of that would be earlier in your career.
Yeah, if you think about it, there are a lot of risky decisions that you take early on, right? I mean, you've taken a risk in choosing the university you're going to go to. Your next big risk will be choosing the first company that you work for. Is it going to be a big company? Is it going to be a small company? Is it going to be banking, consulting, corporate? All of those choices are, in many respects, risks that you need to take, and you need to feel good about them. And that's why it's really important to understand what's important to you, a little bit of where your passions, what kind of environment you want to work in, what are your aspirations over the long term. Having some sense of that helps mitigate the risk of those decisions. But I do think that that first role you take is a very important one. And so that is a risk. I chose public accounting at the time that I graduated from college. It almost was a given that if you were an accounting major, you went into public accounting. And so that wasn't, you had to choose between, at that time there were 8 firms. You had to choose between the firms to decide what felt like the best fit. But it it wasn't as broad and expansive as some of you will face as you make that first career choice. So I do think that is important. And then, I think from there, it really is, oftentimes the risks are bets that you make every day when you think about, how are you going to approach an issue? How are you going to develop the supporting analysis for a decision? How are you going to advocate for a position? Those are all small risks that over time, I think cumulatively can have a very big impact on the results that you deliver. And they don't even feel like risks when you're doing them because they feel like your job. But in fact, you need to do it with a level of intellectual honesty and integrity to make sure that you're driving to the decisions that over time collectively can really deliver good results for the organization you're working for, good support for the people that you're working with, because I think the people really, really matter. And then ultimately for yourself in terms of career success and mobility and the goals that you set for yourself.
Yeah, no, I think that's a really good perspective because I always hear about these huge decisions people are making. That's the big risk. But I think that's really insightful, saying there's a lot of small risks you take in life, but they accumulate over time. So thank you for sharing that. Appreciate it.
Yeah, and I think that really most people probably are not faced with one gigantic life-changing risk decision, right? It doesn't happen that way very often. Sometimes it does. Sometimes it does. Oftentimes it is those, when you choose to take a role in a company or a different company or go to a startup or whatever the case may be. But generally it's lots of smaller things you have to deal with.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah. Thank you. Thank you for sharing that.
Sure.
Yeah, excellent question, Drake. Appreciate the small risk, raising your hand, asking a question. Hopefully this, accumulates over time. Allie, I see you're up next if you want to unmute and introduce yourself and ask your question.
Awesome. Thank you, Ross. So Teri, I just want to thank you for being here tonight. It's been great hearing about your story. So earlier you were discussing your favorite definition of courage, and I really liked how you mentioned that you were encouraging others around you to take risks. What are a few ways that you've done that in your past?
Yeah, so I told you about the story that I had early in my career where a boss who became a mentor encouraged me to go outside my comfort zone. And so I've sort of felt like that was my responsibility over and over again to help others see where their real strength was. And, over the course of my career, I've managed and mentored hundreds of people. And even today, I find it so, now I'm retired, but I still have mentoring calls probably once or twice a week from people who go back maybe 5 years or 10 years or 5 months. And so I really, I feel like that's the part that I can give back on, is that helping people to see what their real strengths are, helping them to see themselves as others see them in a way that allows them to then adapt and know their strengths and play those strengths, but understand their weaknesses and be able to address those as well. So it's a little bit of support and feedback that then gives them that confidence to take some of the risks that they need to be most successful. So, you know, if I think about the thing that has meant the most to me anytime I've left an organization, it has been those farewells and those promises to stay in touch that actually have come true. And the network of people I've built as a consequence is phenomenal. And it is really, to me, the most important thing as I look back over my career is having invested in people and developing those people to be the very best that they can be.
Amazing.
Well,
Thanks.
it's all people. It all comes down to people for me.
Right, right. Allie, thanks for the great question. Sumi, I see you've got your hand up if you want to jump in.
Yes, first of all, thank you, Terry, again for spending your time speaking with us. I think I'm a junior from NYU, and I think your last point segued perfectly into my question. So you mentioned a lot about the confidence to express different ideas and viewpoints and investing in relationships with people that you work with. I'm just curious, in your personal experience, what impactful moments have you had when engaging that diversity of thought? Like, how have you seen that play into the real world, or any impactful moments in your career?
Yeah, absolutely. You know, there are, so in the last few companies I've been in, we've had a lot of strategic issues. So at Gap, for example, you know, anybody who's familiar with retail knows that retail is a very, very tough business, and fashion apparel retail is particularly tough because you need to every season make a bet on what's going to be popular, and you make that bet sometimes a year ahead of that season, and you buy all the inventory, and then you cross your fingers and hope you can sell it. And if you've chosen poorly, then it doesn't get any better as time goes on. And so your only objective is to sell through the inventory as fast as you can. And so there have been so many situations where you are having really tough conversations about whether it's the nature of the buy to make, the quantity of the buy to make, the marketing support that goes behind the buy. There are just so many elements of the day-to-day business that really require diversity of experience and thought to get to the right answer. And what I found particularly in fashion is that there's so much passion in fashion, and there's so much art in fashion, that actually getting data to play into it becomes a bit of a challenge. And so the more voices you can have in the room from different vantage points, from different experience sets, from even different data sources, the higher quality those discussions and decisions are. Because at the end of the day, there are very few things you will do in business where the right answer is crystal clear. It is always a judgment. And so the more people you can have who are thoughtfully and factually bringing data to the conversation, whether that data is good hard number data, quantitative data, or whether it's high qualitative data from diverse experiences, the more you have that in the room and you're really listening to it, the better the quality of the decisions. And so I think that diversity, I always, as a leader, I never assume I'm the smartest person in the room, quite the opposite. I try to surround myself with people who are far smarter than I am. And I intentionally choose people who think differently than I do, because they challenge me then to get out of my box and really understand the issue from a very different vantage point. So I think having voices in the room and really listening to those voices is so critical to quality decision making.
Thank you. That's very insightful. I also just wanted to press you to ask what that meant. The passion in the fashion industry. Does that mean everyone is looking to, I guess, take on a different facet of the business and make it their own, whether it becomes down to design or any other departments? How exactly has that played a role?
Yeah, yeah, it's funny you should say that. So in this case, passion tends to mean the conversations are less about, I know this style will sell because X, Y, Z fact-based, and more like, no, Terry, you don't understand. People are going to love this. It's beautiful. And so that passion without data is one that's tough, because sometimes in fashion, it does come down to that, right? It's an aesthetic, it's a taste, it's a trend. And as a finance person, I say, I know, but we need a return on investment of X. Last time we did this, we only sold Y. You know, you have all this data, and they're saying, no, but you don't understand. This is going to be big. So sometimes it goes away from the data, and sometimes you have to follow it. Sometimes you have to say, all right, I believe you, let's go for it. And other times you say, can't take so many of those big bets. So there's a lot of passion in fashion.
Wow, that sounds very interesting. Thank you for that.
Sumi, great questions, and I appreciate the clarifying question. And Terry, I'm laughing, thinking about the times that I've been on both sides of that table, of that conversation, right? Thinking of when I've had people come to me with that, and when I've done that, right? When I especially early in my career, going to my boss with ideas, like, you don't get it. But if someone in finance, I could only imagine trying to toe that line between making sure the P&L is strong and the financials of the business progress properly, and just taking largely intuition-based bets and risks almost just constantly, right? Yeah, I appreciate you sharing. Jake, I saw that I know you're the host, so you couldn't raise your hand. I see you raised your thumb. Do you want to ask a question?
Yeah, for sure. And thank you for acknowledging my thumb. That's been on. Teri, thank you again for joining us tonight. My name is Jake Kranz. I go to the University of Minnesota here in the Twin Cities. And I know the majority of the conversation tonight has been centered around our value of courage, but I'd love to hear a little bit more about your values. And more specifically, I was wondering if you have one or two values that resonate most deeply with you outside of courage.
It's a good question, one that I probably don't take enough time to really sit down and put into words. You know, I said that I have a favorite leadership definition that has courage and collaboration and risk-taking embedded in it. You know, and I can actually do this because I'm here. The mantra that I have lived by my whole career is on this sign, which I've carried around. My kids and I were at a street fair, and they were walking by and they said, "Mom, this is you." And it says, laugh, believe, take chances, and trust yourself. And that is the mantra that I have approached my career. So it's not high flying integrity kind of things, but actually in there is a lot, because laugh is so important. I told you humor can be a bit of a diffuser. It also can be what you do instead of crying sometimes when you have a really bad day. Believe in people. And I do believe the best in people. I do believe that people are well-intended. I think they come from the right place. Sometimes I'm disappointed in that, but for the most part, I do believe. Take chances. We've talked a lot about that. And trust yourself is really just that confidence thing again. And so those are the things that I live by. And it served me reasonably well, I would say.
It's interesting to hear those. A lot of those, just thinking through them, tie back into our core values at Scholars of Finance. Obviously the one we've been talking about today, but the other one that just is readily available is humility and knowing thyself and trusting yourself and your intuition. So thank you so much for sharing that.
Sure.
I appreciate it. I love that. I want to thank you also, Jake, for the question, and Terry for the answer. I love the sign, and I love that your kids found it. And like, I also think it's so cool that, you talked about earlier being authentic and genuine, right? Just following your heart, right? Following your passion. To me, that's a signal that you're probably such a genuine person that your kids at a young age can even identify on a sign. Hey, this describes you. And you're like, oh my gosh, yes, that does. I'm going to buy that and keep that. Right? I think there's something to be said there about authenticity. With 4 minutes left, I think we have time for one last question. Alex, I see you raised your hand again, so we'll turn it back over to you for our last question today.
Yeah, thanks, Ross. Just kind of wanted to ask you, Terry, since you had experience working at Gap, and I'm a huge Kanye West fan, and they just partnered up for about 10 years. I was just kind of thinking maybe you could give your brief thoughts on the partnership and what you foresee for Gap, given that new announcement.
Yeah. So Kanye, so I left Gap. I stepped down as CFO in March and I left in June. And so the last thing I worked on was actually the Kanye deal. And it was one of those, where diversity of thinking, people had very, very strong views about Kanye himself. And he is a personality for sure. But importantly about whether Kanye was right for Gap. Because the Gap brand stands for American optimism, but its customer base is much older than Kanye's following. And so the idea behind Kanye is tapping into his, he does have a bit of creative genius for sure. And so tapping into that, but also then being able to migrate the brand back to a younger consumer, similar to the way Adidas has as they've worked with him. And so the idea really is to try to keep Gap relevant to a younger consumer by tapping into some of the credibility that Kanye can bring in the fashion world, as he's demonstrated with some other brands. So I think there is, some people feel very, very strongly that this is absolutely the right way to go. Others have some skepticism. And I think the challenge is, and this is a challenge you often have when you have very mature brands like Gap. So Gap is a $4 billion brand, and the average age of its consumer is somewhere probably pushing 50. And so you got $4 billion of revenue coming from people who are not going to be Kanye fans. As you go get those younger consumers, which you absolutely want to keep the brand alive, you can't lose those 50-year-olds. And so navigating that will be, I think, the real challenge for the brand over the next year or so. But his first line will come out in the spring. So we'll see. We'll see how it goes.
Thank you so much, Terry. We really appreciate it.
Great question, Alex. And Terry, thanks for sharing some of that behind the curtain on the deal. It's super interesting to hear. We want to respect your time. With a minute left, I'll move towards closing us out for the evening. Terry, again, thank you so much for joining us this evening for tonight's National Speaker Series.